The break between Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus is often narrated as a personal falling out, a clash of egos, or a disagreement over political allegiance. This framing misses what is essential. The rupture was not accidental, and it was not merely political. It was the point at which two incompatible ethical visions became impossible to reconcile. Sartre and Camus begin from remarkably similar positions. Both reject metaphysical guarantees. Both deny divine justification. Both insist that human beings must live without pre-given meaning. Both emerge from the same historical trauma of war, occupation, and resistance. And both believe that philosophy must confront lived reality rather than retreat into abstraction. Yet it is precisely because they share these starting points that the break becomes so sharp. Their disagreement is not about whether freedom exists, but about what freedom permits once history is taken seriously. It is not about whether action is required, but about whether action has limits that cannot be crossed, even in the name of justice. This is the fault line. For Sartre, freedom is inseparable from commitment. To be free is not merely to choose privately, but to take responsibility for one's position within history. Human beings do not act outside circumstances. They act within concrete situations shaped by power, oppression, and conflict. To refuse engagement, Sartre argues, is itself a choice, one that sides with the status quo. From this perspective, moral purity becomes suspect. Clean hands are often preserved by inaction. Sartre insists that responsibility means accepting the consequences of action, even when those consequences are morally troubling. History does not offer clean choices. It demands decision under constraint. Camus agrees that history demands action, but he refuses Sartre's conclusion. Camus insists that action without limits becomes indistinguishable from domination. The rejection of absolute values does not license absolute violence. Even in an unjust world, Camus argues, there are lines that cannot be crossed without betraying the very idea of justice. This insistence on limits is not moral nostalgia. It is ethical resistance. Camus' central concern is that once murder is justified by history, no boundary remains. Causes expand. Violence normalizes. Responsibility dissolves into necessity. Camus fears that in trying to liberate humanity, one ends by treating human beings as expendable material. This is not a disagreement about tactics. It is a disagreement about whether history itself can ever justify killing. Sartre does not celebrate violence. He does not romanticize bloodshed. But he is willing to tolerate violence as historically unavoidable in certain conditions. Colonialism, exploitation, and systemic oppression do not dissolve through persuasion alone. Sartre insists that refusing to confront this reality risks protecting injustice behind moral idealism. Camus hears in this tolerance the beginning of catastrophe. He insists that violence justified by history does not remain limited. It spreads, rationalizes itself, and demands loyalty. What begins as resistance becomes rule. What begins as necessity becomes doctrine. Camus fears that Sartre's position, however careful, opens the door to unlimited justification. This fear is not abstract. It is grounded in the 20th century itself. Both men are responding to the same world. Revolutions that promise liberation and deliver terror. Movements that begin with justice and end in repression. Sartre believes withdrawal is irresponsible. Camus believes unbounded commitment is lethal. Their disagreement, therefore, centers on a single devastating question. Can injustice ever excuse murder? Sartre answers indirectly. He insists that in a violent world, refusing violence may amount to choosing who is allowed to suffer. Responsibility does not disappear because the options are terrible. One must still choose and accept guilt as part of action. Camus answers directly. He insists that murder cannot be justified without destroying the meaning of justice itself. To kill in the name of humanity is to deny humanity in practice. Responsibility, for Camus, includes the refusal to become what one opposes. This difference cannot be resolved through compromise. Sartre accuses Camus of moral abstraction, of protecting innocence at the cost of effectiveness. Camus accuses Sartre of historical intoxication, of sacrificing limits to necessity. Each sees the other as betraying responsibility in a different way. What makes this conflict so enduring is that both positions are internally coherent. Neither rests on misunderstanding. Neither can absorb the other without collapsing. This is why the break was inevitable. Sartre believes ethics must descend into history, even at the cost of moral contamination. Camus believes ethics must resist history at the point where it demands murder. Sartre accepts guilt as unavoidable. Camus insists guilt must not become permission. The disagreement is not about who is more compassionate. It is about what compassion demands when action becomes destructive. At this stage, it is essential to recognize that Sartre and Camus are not enemies. They are mirrors. Each reveals the cost of the other's position. Sartre exposes the danger of moral retreat. Camus exposes the danger of moral surrender. Their conflict is therefore not a failure of dialogue. It is the point where dialogue reaches its limit. To understand the depth of this rupture, we must move beyond abstraction and examine how their disagreement unfolds in concrete political and philosophical contexts, particularly around revolution, history, and violence. If the conflict between Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus turns on violence, then it must be understood in its full historical seriousness. Neither thinker is speculating abstractly. Both are responding to a century in which violence claims moral legitimacy through history itself. This is where their paths finally diverge. Sartre approaches history as a field of constraint. Individuals do not choose the conditions into which they are thrown, but they are responsible for how they respond to them. In a world structured by exploitation, colonization, and domination, Sartre argues that refusal to act does not preserve innocence. It selects who will continue to suffer. From this perspective, violence appears not as a choice among equals, but as a response to an already violent world. Sartre does not claim that violence is good. He claims that history sometimes leaves no clean alternatives. To act responsibly is to accept that one may become guilty while attempting to reduce injustice. Guilt does not disappear, it is carried. This is crucial. Sartre does not seek moral absolution through history. He accepts contamination as the price of engagement. Responsibility means owning the consequences of action, not pretending they do not exist. Camus cannot accept this. Camus insists that once murder is justified by necessity, nothing prevents its expansion. Violence justified today will demand justification tomorrow. What begins as tragic necessity hardens into moral doctrine. History becomes a tribunal that excuses everything it requires. Camus sees this logic at work in revolutions that devour their own ideals. For Camus, the danger is not that violence sometimes occurs. The danger is that it becomes meaningful, that it is framed as morally necessary rather than morally tragic. Once killing is justified by a cause, human beings become instruments rather than limits. This is why Camus insists on moral restraint even under oppression. Restraint for Camus is not passivity. It is resistance to the logic that turns suffering into justification. To refuse murder is not to refuse struggle. It is to refuse to become what one opposes. Here the conflict sharpens. Sartre believes Camus underestimates structural violence. Colonialism, racism, and economic exploitation are not peaceful conditions. They kill slowly, invisibly, and systematically. To insist on restraint without confronting this violence risks protecting it. Camus believes Sartre underestimates the speed with which justification spreads. Once violence is excused in principle, it loses its tragic character. Murder becomes policy. Responsibility dissolves into obedience to history. Each position exposes a genuine danger. Sartre fears moral purity that leaves injustice intact. Camus fears moral intoxication that destroys limits. Neither fear is misplaced. This is why the break cannot be healed by moderation. There is no midpoint where violence is both justified and forbidden. Either history can excuse killing, or it cannot. The disagreement is categorical. The publication of The Rebel makes this explicit. Camus argues that revolutions betray themselves when they abandon limits. Rebellion begins as refusal of injustice. It becomes tyranny when it claims the right to kill in the name of the future. Sartre reads this as abdication. He sees Camus' insistence on limits as a retreat from history, a refusal to accept responsibility for structural change. Sartre believes that refusing to choose among terrible options is itself a choice, one that allows oppression to persist. Camus hears in Sartre's response the voice of justification he most fears. This is not a misunderstanding, it is a recognition. Camus understands that Sartre is serious. Sartre understands that Camus is serious. Their disagreement is not about sincerity, but about what seriousness demands. For Sartre, seriousness demands engagement even when it corrupts. For Camus, seriousness demands refusal even when it costs effectiveness. Each position accuses the other of betrayal. Sartre accuses Camus of protecting his hands at the expense of others' lives. Camus accuses Sartre of sacrificing limits to history. These accusations are not rhetorical. They cut to the core of ethical responsibility. What makes this conflict enduring is that neither thinker offers comfort. Sartre offers no innocence. Action entails guilt. One must accept responsibility without absolution. Camus offers no redemption through history. Limits must be maintained without guarantee of success. Both positions are tragic. This tragedy is not emotional, it is structural. Modern politics forces choices where every option violates something essential. Sartre and Camus name different violations as intolerable. Their disagreement, therefore, reveals a fracture at the heart of modern ethics. If we refuse violence absolutely, we risk allowing injustice to continue. If we justify violence conditionally, we risk abolishing moral limits. There is no solution that dissolves this tension. This is why Sartre and Camus cannot reconcile. Their disagreement is not personal, it is philosophical to the point of incompatibility. Each position functions as a permanent critique of the other. Sartre exposes the danger of ethical withdrawal. Camus exposes the danger of ethical surrender. Neither danger can be eliminated. The legacy of their conflict is not a verdict. It is a warning. Any politics that claims moral innocence is suspect. Any politics that claims moral necessity is dangerous. Between these warnings, modern responsibility must navigate without guarantees. Sartre and Camus do not give us a rule. They give us a conflict we must continue to think through. Their break is not a historical curiosity. It is a permanent fault line in ethical life. We still stand between them. Every time violence is justified by necessity, Camus' warning returns. Every time restraint leaves injustice untouched, Sartre's accusation resurfaces. There is no final synthesis, and that perhaps is the most honest outcome.